Did I make an entire video just so that I can talk about Root? Yes. Yes, I did.
Welcome to Paint by Numbers War Picasso, a show where we look at game mechanics. In this episode, we're going to look at the history of games to find out where asymmetric mechanics came from, how designers used them, and why players love them.
We're going to be talking about asymmetry in games. Yes, it's more of a design decision than a game mechanic, but it's our show, and Josh was really desperate to talk about Root. So strap in and get ready for a ride.
Asymmetric games are ones that give their players distinct objectives or actions to one another. Sometimes this means playing almost totally different games, but often it just means that each of the game's players will be trying to win in slightly different ways. This often means pitting players against one another on an uneven battleground, where it is very difficult to work out who has the high ground. This uncertainty and unpredictability creates a much more realistic approach to gameplay than something like chess, where both sides start with exactly the same pieces and have identical win states. That's just not realistic. As a result, asymmetric games often feel more elaborate and complex than ones that keep the playing field level.
Here's the deal. I want things from life, you want things from life. I want a pet penguin and a life supply of donuts. You want... I don't know, what do normal people want? In games, asymmetry works in two kinds of ways, and sometimes in both ways in the same game. One way is through differing game objectives. Take the game Risk, playing in mission mode because I have responsibilities that keep me from my dreams and only so much time. In mission mode, as opposed to world domination, you get an objective, usually to capture 1, 2, 3 continents or to wipe out an opposing player. Depends on the edition. That's the first kind of asymmetry that Josh mentioned, asymmetry of objective. I win under different conditions to when you win. That adds a layer of complexity. If we're competing for the same objective, let's say world domination, then me winning inherently means you lose. If I'm trying to conquer North America and Europe, and you're trying to conquer Australia and South America, then we don't necessarily come into conflict, but I still need to dedicate resources to stop you winning before I can. It's even more interesting if I have to guess your objective as well. The second type of asymmetry is asymmetry of ability. In some games, this can be a huge difference. Technically, D&D is like this. If you think of the DM as a player who just has a very different set of things to do than the adventurers. Games like Hero Quest, which I will one day get my hands on, formalize this, with the party playing against the DM. Twilight Struggle, a 2-player game about the Cold War, also does this. The USA can do things that the Soviet Union can't, and vice versa. I think that's another game that I so far have only dreamed of playing. Games can be on a bit of a spectrum here, from full asymmetry where none of your abilities match the other players, to the other end where they're mostly the same, but maybe with a few differences for flavour or challenge. Many games sit somewhere in the middle.
Asymmetry shows up in lots of different kinds of games, but often in ones that focus on strategy, like war games. It also appears in games with an all versus one playstyle, like D&D as Matt mentioned, or games like Imperial Assault. In video games, it often shows up in more of a head-to-head PvP sense in games like Evolve, and most MOBAs have at least a little, but often quite a lot, of asymmetrical DNA. Asymmetry has been an important feature in games for a very long time. One of the earliest known examples being Hnaftafl, a medieval Scandinavian game that probably evolved as an asymmetrical variant of Ludus Latrunculorum, a drafts-like Roman game about which we sadly know very little. In the Poetic Edda, a collection of Old Norse stories, it's said that when the Norse gods finished creating the universe, they then took a break and played a game of Hnaftafl, which would mean that this game has been around since almost the dawn of time. Now, before Matt complains about my investigative integrity, I will state that there is no real way to determine the validity of this source. No way to prove either way if the Norse gods actually did create the universe, let alone whether they played this game afterwards. But what we can take from this is that when the Poetic Edda was written, this game was definitely around, which dates it to around 1270 at least, but probably the game is even older than that. From here, the idea of games being asymmetrical continued very naturally into wargames, with players having different troops or different starting advantages like terrain or supplies. The mechanic then made the jump to video games as wargames became digitized. Axis and Allies from 1981 is often credited with being at the start of this transition, when Hasbro released a video game adaptation in 1998. Following on, as multiplayer games became more and more prevalent, designers found more and more creative ways to pit players against one another, leading to games like Splinter Cell Pandora Tomorrow in 2004, which has a multiplayer mode where some players are combat-focused mercenaries, going head-to-head with other players who are playing as much more stealth-focused spies.
For some, asymmetry can feel unfair. Decisions made before the game begins can cause restrictions to how you play, making you feel like the outcome was predetermined. This is the realm of the poorly designed asymmetrical game though, one that can be quite easy to fall into. When it's gotten right, asymmetry can make players feel more expressive as they lean into their individual playstyle and hone their skills there. If you ever get bored, you can switch things up and have a whole new set of interactions that you can dig your teeth into. This contributes greatly to replayability and skill expression. Different factions can allow players to find their groove and, especially in co-op games, lead to group dynamics where everyone's contribution is valuable. Asymmetry inherently requires other players who are different. That's what it is. Meaning, in the right game, you can expand on your differences and indulge in role-playing, teaming up, having rivalries, and forming relationships with your fellow players.
Asymmetry adds so much to a game. It creates a much more complex environment where players have to make decisions knowing that their opponents aren't using the same logic as them. Being strategic is drastically harder but infinitely more rewarding when you get to outsmart or outplay someone despite playing a game that isn't strictly balanced. The board game Dune is a fantastic example of this challenge-reward boost. I have the 2019 reprint of the 1979 classic that sits players around a map of Arrakis, each playing as separate factions from the Duniverse trying to claim dominance of the planet. There are fundamental rules that every faction plays by, but each individual player gets to bend or break some of them to their own advantage. For example, the House Atreides player can look at certain decks of cards before they're revealed to the other players, and are the only player allowed to take notes during the game. Some factions are drenched in wealth by the other players, like the Spacing Guild, who receive spice from any other players who want to ship forces onto the planet, while other players are reliant on sending armies out into the hostile desert trying to claim spice deposits before they're whisked away by storms or sandworms. To win the game, you need spice. But you never know where the spice is going to come from or who is going to end up holding it. It's an awesome asymmetrical extravaganza. Utilising asymmetry also makes a game incredibly replayable. If each player is playing by slightly inconsistent rules, there is far more variation in the possible outcomes. Different factions in wargames collide in unique ways, and it can be an exciting challenge to try and find the best or most fun way to play. Character-driven MOBAs are a great example of replayable asymmetry in games. My personal favourite is Smite, a tower-destroying laner a la Dota 2, in which you play as individual gods from across an incredible array of mythologies. There's always a new god to try, maybe in a role you don't normally play, to shake up the gameplay and keep things interesting. For all the love I've been giving it, there are some real hard trade-offs to talk about when utilising asymmetry in a game. A designer potentially has to create multiple different systems for each player, sometimes to the point where it's almost a totally different game. And then, somehow, as if by some dark sorcery, all of these systems have to interact together in a way that is more or less balanced, if not at least fair across the board. This is a tremendous amount of work. On the player's end, making a game asymmetric often means there are loads more rules to learn, especially for board games. One player has to be familiar, if not fluent, in all of the rules for every other player to ensure a smooth playing experience, which can mean that that player has a much deeper understanding of the game, giving them an unfair advantage. There's also the possibility that some choices end up being objectively worse than others. In a game where you have to pick a faction, there might be factions that are harder to play or underpowered in comparison. I think one of the only real failures a game designer can make is to present a player with a choice where there's an obvious right and wrong answer. Then there's no choice at all. Some asymmetric games, like Star Wars Imperial Assault, put one player in charge of all the baddies, while the other players play the good side. This can be tremendously fun as you eviscerate the forces of good, right up until your friends get sad and never want to play games with you ever again. This extends further into games like D&D and other TTRPGs, where one player has to put in a huge amount of work in advance to prepare the game, while the other players just rock up and enjoy. I personally quite like preparing a session, but it definitely takes its time, and there are occasions when I would much rather just crack open Root and have a game of that instead. Speaking of cracking open Root, this box contains a staggering amount of asymmetrical joy. Each player plays as a different faction attempting to take control of the woodlands. In the base game, you have your standard fascist cats attempting an industrial revolution, your aristocratic birds doing their best to align politically for just long enough to stamp out the upstarts, your rebel alliance of miscellaneous woodland creatures using devastating guerrilla warfare tactics to try and overthrow their oppressors, and a little raccoon who just goes about doing cute little quests and then absolutely demolishes the other players' plans. Every expansion adds further equally amazing new factions to just bash against each other. Each faction has such a unique flavour. While the fighting and point system is the same for everyone, each player gets their own board with what is essentially their own personal game to play. How well you do in the woodland is drastically influenced by how well you do on your own little game. For example, the cats get an engine builder. They build sawmills to cut wood to build other buildings to allow them to craft things and recruit more troops. They start in control of most of the forest and then spend the rest of the game in a desperate battle to hold on to enough land to just build enough buildings to get enough points to win. Each other faction is just as interesting, with their own gameplay verbs and little surprises to discover as you play. The best bit? This art by Carl Ferrin is so adorable that you can easily use it to trick other people into playing the game before they realise that underneath this cutesy exterior is a deep, dark wargame, capable of tearing friendships apart. It's truly wonderful.
You all know what I'm going to say. Josh mentioned wargaming earlier, and here's my favourite asymmetric game, Warhammer 40k. Not because the mechanic is done particularly well here, but for the sheer love I have for my faction. In a galaxy filled with superhumans, space elves, ravenous bugs, eldritch horrors, I decided to play the faction of normal people with tanks. On the table, their uniqueness comes from access to heavy tanks and masses of low quality infantry. Their unique ability has varied from edition to edition, but usually revolves around an order system where commander units can give orders to subordinate units, which buffs them. I could try and talk about how these unique abilities underpin my love for the faction, and how I yearn to once again test my strategic mastery against my opponents. But that would be a lie. I have no strategic mastery. And the real reason I love my faction is because I adore tanks.
I love class or faction-based games like Rainbow Six Siege, Team Fortress 2 or Homeworld. They count as asymmetrical, right? Each player has different abilities that make them unique, creating interesting dynamics when they interact. Deep Rock Galactic has been my favourite for the last few years. It brings together a team of dwarves and tells them to get to mining cooperatively while blasting away bugs. With 4 classes, the game leans heavily into their differences, giving everyone a chance to contribute to the team's success. It's set in cave systems where mobility is key, and each dwarf is given their own unique way to deal with it, like the gunner's zipline launcher that allows him to set up ziplines across a cavern that everyone in the squad can use. The driller's mobility weapon allows him to dig walkable caverns through the cave. These are again valuable for the team, letting them overcome other obstacles, like reaching a nearby tunnel or digging desperately to the drop pod right at the end of a mission. The interplay between each class's available weaponry makes for some wonderful combination and leads to on-the-fly problem solving as a team. The asymmetry between the players is the key, letting them indulge in their own favourite aspects of the game, while making teamwork an inevitability. It works brilliantly to generate both collaboration and a bit of friendly competition.
Asymmetry is a weird one. It can crop up without being deliberately designed into a game. Chess, as we mentioned earlier, it's a perfectly symmetrical rule set. Same objective, same pieces, same abilities. And yet, because of first turn advantage, white and black play very differently. White tends to play a very aggressive game, setting the tempo, looking to trade. Black, at least under the suggestion of many masters, is much better playing a faster, looser style. But typically, black plays a very reactive game, until white either loses the advantage or makes a mistake. So sometimes the question with asymmetry is not how you introduce it to a rule set, but how you take it out.
Okay, let's round this all off. Asymmetry in a game is a great way to add complexity and depth, especially in games that pit players against one another. Asymmetrical mechanics can create an experience that feels more unique and unknowable from play to play, adding loads of entertaining replayability. This does come at the cost of a lot more design work from the game devs as they design and balance all these different systems, and can, if not executed right, culminate in a game that is sometimes one-sided or difficult to learn and teach. For some people, that might be a complete turn-off, but for others, me included, that can be something to get really excited about. If you think you or your audience might be interested, you should definitely get some asymmetry into the games that you make or play.
Thanks for watching this episode of Paint by Numbers War Picasso. If you had a good time or learned something, give us a like. We release one of these game mechanic episodes every month, so go subscribe to be first in the queue for the next one.
If you're interested in what we're developing, go check out the bonus levels section of our website for early access to new games as they're being created. Link in the description. Next month, we'll be talking about
turn-based gameplay.
So be sure to check back then. See you next time.
Yes! Yeah, that's it.